The autumn afternoon hung golden over St. Mary Mead, with that peculiar quality of light that made even the most ordinary cottage garden appear touched by magic. Elder Lane curved gently away from the village green, its cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of careful footsteps, and at its furthest end stood what had once been the old Dower House, a charming Tudor cottage with diamond-paned windows and climbing roses that had surrendered their last blooms to October's gentle insistence. Miss Jane Marple paused at the wrought-iron gate, adjusting her sensible gloves as she surveyed the transformation that had taken place over the past 6 months. Where old Mrs. Pemberton's neglected garden had once struggled against encroaching brambles, there now flourished neat borders of lavender, rosemary, and other aromatic herbs. A discreet brass nameplate beside the door read "Essence and Memory, Fine Perfumery," and through the gleaming windows one could glimpse shelves lined with amber bottles and crystal decanters that caught the afternoon light like captured sunshine. The proprietress, Mrs. Vivian Ashworth, had arrived in St. Mary Mead that spring with little fanfare but considerable mystery. A woman of perhaps 45, with prematurely silver hair swept into an elegant chignon and the sort of refined bearing that suggested a past more sophisticated than village commerce typically required. She had purchased the cottage outright and set about its renovation with quiet efficiency. Her background remained tantalizingly vague. Something about a late husband's business interests, a mention of years spent in France, and the sort of practiced charm that spoke of experience managing more demanding clientele than the good people of St. Mary Mead typically provided. Today marked the grand unveiling of her Autumn Reverie collection, and the invitations, embossed on cream paper with delicate botanical illustrations, had been extended to every notable resident of the village. Miss Marple had accepted with genuine curiosity, drawn not so much by any pressing need for French perfume as by that particular interest in human nature that had served her so well over the years. The cottage's front garden had been transformed into an elegant outdoor salon. Small tables draped in ivory linen dotted the space between the herb borders, each set with crystal glasses and silver trays bearing delicate canapes. Chinese lanterns, strung between the fruit trees, cast a warm glow over the gathering, while the scent of Mrs. Ashworth's creations mingled with the natural fragrance of the garden to create an almost intoxicating atmosphere. Miss Marple settled herself at a table near the cottage wall, from which vantage point she could observe the proceedings while appearing to do nothing more threatening than enjoy the pleasant evening air. Her knitting bag rested beside her chair, and she withdrew a half-finished baby shawl, a gift for her great-nephew's newest arrival, allowing her fingers to work the familiar pattern while her pale blue eyes took careful inventory of the assembled company. Mrs. Dolly Bantry had arrived early, resplendent in a purple velvet coat that had seen better decades but which she wore with undiminished confidence. She was deep in conversation with Colonel Melchett, recently retired from India, whose military bearing remained uncompromised by civilian life. Near the cottage door, Dr. Haydock examined a display of bottled essences with professional interest, occasionally lifting a stopper to sample the contents with the sort of methodical attention he typically reserved for examining throats and checking pulses. "Such an enchanting establishment," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with the satisfied air of one who had secured the best possible position for observation. "Though, I must say, there's something rather continental about it all. Not quite what one expects in an English village, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered this observation. "Change can be unsettling," she agreed gently, "though I've often found that the most interesting people are those who carry a little mystery with them, rather like a good perfume, wouldn't you say? One catches hints of something complex beneath the surface." The guest of honor emerged from the cottage at precisely 6 o'clock, moving through her garden with the grace of a woman accustomed to being watched. Mrs. Ashworth wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that complemented her silver hair, and at her throat gleamed a single strand of pearls that caught the lantern light. She carried herself with the sort of quiet confidence that comes from knowing one's own worth, yet Miss Marple detected something else in her manner. A watchfulness, perhaps, or the subtle tension of someone who had learned to be always slightly on guard. "My dear friends and neighbors," Mrs. Ashworth began, her voice carrying clearly across the garden, "it gives me such pleasure to share this evening with you. When I first arrived in St. Mary Mead, I wondered if a village might embrace something as frivolous as fine perfumery. But I've discovered that beauty is never frivolous. It's essential. Tonight I unveil Autumn Reverie, a collection inspired by the changing seasons and the eternal mystery of memory itself." She gestured toward a table draped in midnight blue velvet, upon which stood a collection of crystal bottles, each tied with a golden ribbon. The centerpiece was a larger flacon filled with amber liquid that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "Each scent tells a story," Mrs. Ashworth continued, lifting the central bottle with ceremonial care. "This one speaks of October evenings, of wood smoke and fallen leaves, of secrets whispered in twilight gardens. I call it Remembrance, and I invite you all to share in its first blessing." She poured the perfume into a crystal atomizer and began to move through the garden, offering each guest a delicate mist of the fragrance. Miss Marple accepted her portion with gracious thanks, noting how the scent seemed to evolve on the skin, beginning with notes of bergamot and rose, then deepening into something more complex. Sandalwood, perhaps, with hints of something darker and more mysterious beneath. The evening progressed with the sort of gentle conviviality that marked the best village gatherings. Champagne flowed freely, the canapés proved delicious, and the conversation maintained that perfect balance between genuine interest and polite restraint. Mrs. Ashworth moved among her guests like a consummate hostess, ensuring that glasses remained filled and that even the most retiring individuals felt included in the celebration. It was Colonel Melchett who suggested the toast. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, raising his champagne flute, "I propose we honor our gracious hostess and her remarkable achievement. To Mrs. Ashworth and to Autumn Reverie, may both bring beauty and joy to our little corner of England." The assembled company raised their glasses in unanimous agreement. Mrs. Ashworth, visibly moved by the gesture, lifted her own flute with a smile that seemed to encompass genuine gratitude and something else, relief perhaps, or the satisfaction of a goal achieved. "To new beginnings," she said softly, "and to the kindness of strangers who become friends." The toast was drunk with enthusiasm, and for a moment the garden filled with the warm sound of appreciation and pleasure. It was then, in that moment of perfect contentment, that everything changed. Mrs. Ashworth's smile faltered first, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes that Miss Marple noticed with the sort of attention that comes from a lifetime of observing human nature. The perfumer's hand, still holding her champagne flute, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. A look of confusion crossed her elegant features, followed quickly by something that might have been fear. Excuse me," she murmured, setting down her glass with careful precision. "I feel rather—" The words died on her lips as her face went pale beneath her carefully applied cosmetics. She swayed slightly, one hand reaching out as if to steady herself against an invisible support. Dr. Haydock, with the quick reflexes of long medical practice, was already moving toward her when she collapsed. The crystal flute shattered against the flagstones, its sharp music cutting through the sudden silence that had fallen over the garden. Mrs. Ashworth crumpled with terrible grace, her sapphire gown spreading around her like spilled water, the strand of pearls at her throat catching the lantern light one final time before lying still. Dr. Haydock was beside her in an instant, his fingers seeking the pulse at her throat, while his other hand loosened the collar of her gown. The other guests stood frozen in that peculiar paralysis that accompanies the sudden arrival of tragedy in the midst of celebration. Mrs. Bantry's hand flew to her mouth, Colonel Melchett stepped forward as if to offer assistance, and Mrs. Price Ridley made a small, shocked sound that seemed to break the spell of silence. "Stand back, please," Dr. Haydock commanded with quiet authority. "Give her air." But Miss Marple, rising slowly from her chair, could see in the doctor's face what he had not yet spoken aloud. Mrs. Vivian Ashworth, who had arrived in St. Mary Mead with such mystery, and had created such beauty in her brief time among them, would create no more perfumes. The autumn evening, so perfect in its golden tranquility, had become the stage for something far darker than anyone could have imagined. As the doctor continued his futile ministrations and someone ran to telephone for the police, Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the shattered champagne flute. Among the crystal fragments, she noticed something that made her pale eyebrows draw together in the faintest of frowns. There, caught on a shard of glass, was a single drop of liquid that seemed somehow different from the champagne, thicker, perhaps, with a faint oily sheen that caught the lantern light. She said nothing, of course. There would be time for observations later when the proper authorities had taken charge and the immediate shock had subsided. But as the golden evening deepened into night and the first constable arrived to take charge of what had so suddenly become a crime scene, Miss Marple found herself thinking about perfumes and their mysteries, about the stories sense could tell, and about the particular tragedy of a life ended just as it seemed to be beginning anew. The fragrance of remembrance still lingered in the garden air, but now it carried with it the weight of a very different sort of memory, one that would haunt the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead for some time to come. The news of Mrs. Ashworth's sudden death spread through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar velocity that accompanies tragedy in small communities. By morning, the golden tranquility of the previous evening had been replaced by an atmosphere of hushed speculation and barely contained excitement. The official cause would not be determined until after the post-mortem examination. But Dr. Haydock's grim expression as he emerged from his consultation with Inspector Slack told its own story. Miss Marple encountered her first sampling of village opinion while collecting her morning milk from young Tommy Pierce, whose bicycle route made him an inadvertent courier of gossip. The boy's naturally cheerful disposition had been subdued by recent events, but his appetite for drama remained undiminished. "Mum says it was her heart, Miss Marple," he confided in a conspiratorial whisper, but Mrs. Bantry told our cook it was something she ate at her own party. Ironic, that would be. He paused, then added with the casual brutality of youth, "Course, Mr. Tom at the butcher's swears he saw a motor car waiting by the back hedge at dusk. Sleek as a cat, he said, though nobody could say whose." At the village shop, Miss Marple found Mrs. Price Ridley in animated discussion with Miss Weatherby, whose cottage commanded an excellent view of the Perfumery. Both ladies possessed the sharp observational skills that come from years of monitoring neighborhood activities. "I've always maintained there was something not quite right about that woman," Mrs. Price Ridley was declaring with the satisfaction of vindicated suspicion. "All that mysterious talk about France and her late husband's business. The amount of correspondence she received was extraordinary. Letters from London, some from abroad, always in expensive envelopes." Miss Weatherby nodded vigorously. "And that gentleman who called last week, Mr. Cyril Whitcomb from London, raised his voice, something dreadful he did. Money troubles, I shouldn't wonder." Miss Marple selected her purchases with deliberate care, allowing the conversation to flow around her while considering these observations. Extensive correspondence suggested connections beyond simple village commerce, and a visitor from London who argued about money painted an increasingly complex picture of Mrs. Ashworth's circumstances. The most intriguing intelligence came from Mrs. Bantry, encountered later at the post office. Dolly Bantry possessed the invaluable quality of being genuinely interested in people rather than merely curious about their secrets. The poor woman seemed genuinely happy here, Mrs. Bantry reflected. "I visited her just last week to purchase jasmine scent, and she spoke with such enthusiasm about her winter plans. She was going to offer classes in perfume blending, thought the village ladies might enjoy learning the art. This struck Miss Marple as significant. A woman planning for the future, making community investments, seemed unlikely to harbor desperate secrets leading to self-destruction, yet the alternative possibilities were equally troubling. Dr. Haydock, encountered outside the surgery, proved reluctant to discuss details, but could not entirely conceal his puzzlement. Perfectly healthy woman, as far as I could determine. He admitted, when pressed gently, no history of heart trouble, no obvious distress until those final moments. The preliminary examination suggests poison, something fast-acting and highly potent. Most peculiar business altogether. Inspector Slack's arrival brought official authority, though his initial assessment leaned toward complications from natural causes. However, by afternoon his confidence appeared shaken. The Perfumery was cordoned off with tape that fluttered ominously in the autumn breeze, and constables began a methodical search of the premises. Colonel Melchett, maintaining his military bearing despite civilian circumstances, favored theories of international intrigue. "Professional job, I'd wager," he declared to anyone who would listen. "Silent, efficient. These continental types have enemies one wouldn't dream of." But it was young Lily Barton's sudden disappearance that provided the most concrete cause for concern. The pale shop girl with clever hands and unfortunate spectacles had worked part-time at the Perfumery, helping with bottling and labeling. She had left early the previous evening with a suitcase, claiming to visit an aunt whose address proved, upon investigation, to exist primarily in reputation. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the day in quiet contemplation, her knitting needles working steadily while her mind turned over the accumulating fragments. The mysterious London visitor arguing about money, the extensive foreign correspondence, the missing assistant, and most puzzling of all, the method itself. Poison administered with such precision at a public gathering suggested either remarkable boldness or intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. As evening approached and the village settled into that peculiar state of suspended animation following unexpected tragedy, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the shattered champagne flute and that single drop of liquid she had noticed among the crystal fragments. Something was not quite right about the accepted version of events, though she could not yet articulate precisely what troubled her about the official theory. The morning brought Inspector Slack's preliminary findings, delivered with a sort of official certainty that brooked no argument. Miss Marple encountered him outside the Perfumery, his notebook thick with what appeared to be conclusive evidence, his manner suggesting a case already solved. "Deliberate poisoning," he announced to the small crowd that had gathered despite the early hour. "Digitalis, concentrated foxglove extract. Highly sophisticated preparation, indicating someone with considerable botanical knowledge." He gestured toward Mrs. Ashworth's herb garden, where purple foxglove spires drooped with autumn's advance. "Plenty of raw material right here on the premises." Dr. Haydock, standing nearby with his medical bag, looked troubled by this swift conclusion. The concentration required would indicate either professional training or extensive research, he observed carefully, not something one stumbles upon by accident. The inspector's attention had focused entirely on the missing shop assistant, Lily Barton. Her sudden departure immediately following the tragedy struck him as conclusively suspicious, particularly given her grandmother's reputation as an herbalist and her intimate knowledge of the Perfumery's operations. "Clear case," Slack declared with satisfaction. "Young woman had opportunity, means, and motive. Been pilfering from the till, according to the account books. Mrs. Ashworth confronted her that very afternoon. Desperate people take desperate measures." This theory found eager acceptance throughout the village. Mrs. Price Ridley, holding court at the general store, proclaimed she had always sensed something shifty about Lily Barton. "Never looked one straight in the eye," she declared, "always hovering about with those thick spectacles, and her grandmother was known for supplying questionable remedies to half the county." Miss Marple listened to these pronouncements with the polite attention of someone genuinely interested in her neighbor's opinions, though her pale blue eyes remained thoughtful. During her morning constitutional, she had taken the opportunity to examine the herb garden more closely, and several observations struck her as curious. The foxglove plants showed no signs of recent harvesting. Their seed heads remained intact, their lower leaves undisturbed. For someone supposedly gathering poison in desperate haste, Lily Barton had been remarkably careful to leave no evidence. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Cyril Whitcomb, the London gentleman whose previous visit had caused such speculation. He appeared at the village inn driving a sleek motor car that matched young Tommy Pierce's breathless description, though his demeanor suggested genuine grief rather than guilt. Terrible business, he confided when they encountered each other outside St. Mary Mead's ancient church. Vivian was a remarkable woman, though she carried burdens few understood. Her husband's death left her with obligations that followed her even here. Not entirely legitimate business dealings, I'm afraid. This revelation cast Mrs. Ashworth's circumstances in an entirely different light. Rather than the mysterious continental sophisticate of village imagination, she emerged as a woman fleeing financial difficulties, seeking refuge in rural anonymity. The extensive correspondence might represent creditors rather than conspirators, and her careful cultivation of village acceptance took on desperate significance. I came to warn her that certain parties had discovered her location, Mr. Whitcomb continued, his voice heavy with regret. There were debts, substantial ones, owed to people who don't typically accept delayed payment gracefully. She was terrified they might resort to more direct methods of collection. Miss Marple absorbed this information while appearing to focus entirely on feeding breadcrumbs to the churchyard sparrows. The possibility of professional enforcement rather than amateur poisoning opened new avenues of consideration, yet the method remained puzzling. Why choose such a public venue for elimination, and why employ a poison that pointed so obviously toward local botanical knowledge? Later that afternoon, she found herself drawn back to Elder Lane, where the perfumery stood silent behind its flutter of police tape. The cottage seemed to watch her approach with darkened windows, its herb garden releasing faint ghosts of yesterday's fragrances. Near the service entrance, she noticed details that had escaped official attention. A length of twine hanging from the bell pull, frayed and hastily retied, and in the soft earth beneath, two distinct sets of footprints, one heavy and square, the other lighter, more hurried. Inside, through the diamond-paned windows, she could glimpse the midnight velvet table where the autumn reverie collection had been displayed. Even from this distance, she could see the faint impressions left by the removed bottles, and near the center, where the remembrance flacon had stood, a small dark stain that caught the afternoon light with an oily sheen quite different from spilled champagne. Dr. Haydock, encountered later outside his surgery, looked utterly exhausted by the day's revelations. Over a cup of chamomile tea, he shared his professional puzzlement. Most sophisticated poison I've encountered, he admitted. The concentration was precise, enough to be immediately fatal, but administered with remarkable accuracy. And there was something else, an old scar on her left wrist, almost healed. Nothing significant, of course, but curious in someone so careful about her appearance. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she considered this detail alongside her other observations. A sophisticated poison, hurried footprints, an oily stain where none should be, and the memory of Mrs. Ashworth's careful watchfulness throughout the evening. The official theories satisfied the inspector's need for swift resolution and the village's appetite for dramatic conclusion, but experience had taught her that the most obvious solutions often concealed more complex truths. As evening approached and the village settled into that peculiar state of suspended animation following unexpected tragedy, she found herself thinking about the precise timing of Mrs. Ashworth's collapse. The poison had clearly been administered during the toast itself, yet the mechanism remained frustratingly unclear. How does one poison a single glass when all are poured from the same bottle, in full view of 20 witnesses? Something fundamental was missing from the accepted narrative, though she could not yet articulate what that crucial element might be. But patterns, like the lingering scent of rosemary, had a way of revealing themselves to those patient enough to wait and observant enough to notice when they did. Inspector Slack returned to the village green with the satisfaction of a man whose theories had been vindicated by evidence. In his hand, he carried a small brown bottle labeled Digitalis Extract, in neat script, discovered among Lily Barton's possessions at her lodgings. A railway porter at Brackhampton had confirmed selling her a ticket to London the previous evening, and her landlady reported finding a typed note in her sewing box. One more irregularity, and you will be dismissed without a character. The village arranged itself around this revelation with the comfortable certainty that comes from having mysteries resolved. Mrs. Price Ridley proclaimed vindication of her suspicions about modern girls and their moral deficiencies, while Colonel Melchett grudgingly admitted that Slack's investigation had been thorough as a military operation. Even Dr. Haydock, when pressed, confirmed that the post-mortem revealed digitalis poisoning consistent with a concentrated botanical preparation. Miss Marple absorbed these developments while tending her knitting, though certain details troubled her methodical mind. The sophistication of the poison struck her as remarkable for someone of Lily's limited experience, and during her afternoon constitutional, she found herself drawn to the Barton cottage at the village's edge. Mrs. Barton, a spare woman with intelligent eyes, received her visitor with defiant weariness. "My Lily hasn't got it in her to hurt anyone," she declared firmly. "She knows foxglove is dangerous, certainly, but preparing a killing dose, that requires knowledge she doesn't possess. I've been working with herbs for 50 years, Miss Marple, and even I wouldn't attempt such precision without proper equipment and extensive study." This distinction struck Miss Marple as crucial. Village herbalism typically involved dried preparations and tisanes, not the laboratory-quality extract that had killed Mrs. Ashworth. The old woman's assessment of her granddaughter's limitations carried the weight of professional expertise. "Did Lily mention any particular difficulties at the perfumery?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Barton's expression darkened. She spoke of arguments, raised voices. That London gentleman, Mr. Whitcomb, came several times, always agitated about money matters, and there was another visitor, a sharp-tongued woman who knew Mrs. Ashworth from before. Lily overheard them quarreling about past indiscretions and unpaid obligations. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Ashworth's London solicitor, Mr. Geoffrey Pemberton, outside the post office. His expensive motor car and city tailoring marked him as distinctly foreign to village life, yet his manner suggested genuine grief rather than mere professional concern. Mrs. Ashworth's situation was more complex than anyone realized, he confided when Miss Marple politely inquired about recent events. Her late husband's import business involved certain irregularities that attracted unwelcome attention from both creditors and government departments. She came here seeking sanctuary, hoping to establish legitimate commerce while addressing her financial obligations. This revelation cast the victim's circumstances in an entirely different light. Rather than mysterious continental sophistication, Mrs. Ashworth emerged as a frightened woman fleeing consequences not entirely of her own making. Her careful cultivation of village acceptance took on desperate significance, yet the method of elimination remained puzzling. Professional debt collectors typically favored more direct approaches than sophisticated botanical poisoning at public gatherings. The choice of digitalis, with its obvious connection to the cottage's herb garden, seemed designed to implicate local knowledge rather than external threats. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the day in quiet contemplation, returning once more to examine the perfumery's exterior. The frayed bell pull she had noticed earlier showed signs of hasty repair, newer twine with a distinctly different weave pattern. Near the service entrance, 2 sets of footprints remained visible in the soft earth, one heavy and square-toed, the other lighter and more hurried. Through the diamond-paned windows, she could glimpse the midnight velvet display table where the Autumn Reverie collection had been arranged. The dark stain at its center, oily under the afternoon light, remained clearly visible. Oil suggested perfume rather than champagne, yet Mrs. Ashworth had collapsed after the toast, not after the blessing of scent. Most intriguing was the typed dismissal note found among Lily's possessions. Mr. Pemberton had mentioned, almost casually, that Mrs. Ashworth was hopeless with typewriters and preferred fountain pens. The note's mechanical precision seemed inconsistent with someone who avoided such devices. As evening approached and the village settled into satisfied resolution, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the precise timing of Mrs. Ashworth's collapse and the single drop of oily liquid she had noticed among the shattered champagne glass fragments. The official theory satisfied everyone's need for swift conclusion, yet fundamental questions remained unanswered. Someone had taken considerable care to create evidence pointing toward Lily Barton while concealing their own involvement. The truth lay hidden beneath layers of misdirection, waiting for someone patient enough to untangle the carefully constructed deception that had fooled everyone except a quiet old lady with sharp eyes and an understanding of human nature. The village had nearly settled its collective mind about Lily Barton's guilt when Miss Marple made a discovery that cast the entire investigation in a different light. During her morning visit to the vicarage, young Mrs. Clement mentioned something troubling about the dismissal note found among Lily's possessions. "It had such a peculiar appearance," Griselda confided over tea. "Far too perfect, if you understand my meaning. Our Women's Institute typewriter has distinctive quirks. The capital R drops slightly below the line, and the letter E shows a small nick in its upper curve. But this note displayed none of those telltale imperfections." Miss Marple found this observation fascinating. A quick examination of the Blue Boar's luncheon menu, typed on the village's only other machine, confirmed Griselda's assessment. The dismissal note's flawless alignment suggested it had been prepared elsewhere by someone with access to superior equipment, hardly consistent with desperate improvisation by a village shop girl. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of an elegant stranger at the Blue Boar. Mrs. Clarice Rowan introduced herself as Mrs. Ashworth's dearest friend from France, claiming to have rushed from Bath upon reading newspaper accounts of the tragedy. Yet her intimate knowledge of village details and her immediate demand for Mrs. Ashworth's correspondence suggested more recent familiarity than her story indicated. Vivian was tragically naive about people, Mrs. Rowan declared to anyone who would listen. She trusted too easily and believed geography could solve financial difficulties. Such a shame about her attachment to that dreadful crystal atomizer, a wedding gift she insisted on using for every special occasion. This casual reference to the atomizer struck Miss Marple as significant. The official investigation had focused entirely on the champagne, yet Mrs. Ashworth had used the crystal atomizer to bless each guest with her remembrance fragrance during the evening's ceremony. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple managed a discreet examination of the perfumery's interior. The midnight velvet display table still bore faint impressions where the perfume bottles had stood, and at its center, that mysterious dark stain caught the light with an oily sheen, quite different from spilled champagne. Near the stain, she noticed a shadowed ring with one edge paler than the rest, the unmistakable mark left by a glass base lifted before the liquid beneath had completely dried. More intriguingly, she discovered a small, unstoppered vial tucked behind promotional leaflets on a lower shelf. Though recently rinsed, it retained traces of a synthetic sweetness that matched the oily stain exactly. This was no display piece, but a utilitarian vessel designed for discreet use, small enough to be concealed within a palm. The bell pull at the service entrance revealed additional evidence of hasty activity. The replacement twine was finer than the original rope, silken thread more suited to craft work than utilitarian repair. In the soft earth beneath, two distinct sets of footprints remained visible. One heavy and square-toed, the other lighter with a pointed toe, quite unlike Lily Barton's practical shoes. Dr. Haydock's post-mortem findings suddenly took on new significance. The traces of oil found on Mrs. Ashworth's lips and throat, initially attributed to cosmetics, now suggested an entirely different delivery method. Perfume, with its oil-based composition, would provide an ideal vehicle for poison, particularly if the victim could be induced to inhale or taste the contaminated fragrance. The precision of the crime became clear as Miss Marple reconstructed the evening's events. Someone with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's habits had contaminated her personal atomizer, knowing she would use it during the blessing ceremony. The poison had been administered not through champagne consumed by all, but through a ritual performed by the victim alone. Mrs. Rowan's convenient arrival, her detailed knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's personal belongings, and her familiarity with the atomizer's significance painted a picture of calculated deception. The evidence against Lily Barton, the digitalis bottle, the typed note, even her suspicious departure, had been carefully constructed to deflect suspicion from the true perpetrator. As evening approached and the village maintained its satisfied conviction about Lily's guilt, Miss Marple reflected on the elaborate misdirection that had fooled everyone except a quiet old lady with sharp eyes and an understanding of human nature. The real killer possessed not only botanical knowledge, but intimate familiarity with the victim's personal habits, qualifications that fit the mysterious Mrs. Rowan far better than they fit the missing shop assistant. Someone had taken considerable care to construct a false narrative while concealing their own involvement, but patterns had begun to emerge for those patient enough to observe them. The truth lay hidden beneath layers of deception, waiting to be revealed by someone who understood that the most obvious solutions often concealed more complex realities. The village's satisfaction with Inspector Slack's tidy resolution began to fracture when Mrs. Bantry, with characteristic determination to sort things properly, arranged an impromptu tea gathering at her drawing room. She had extended invitations to all the principal figures, declaring that a proper discussion over decent tea might help everyone understand the tragic events more clearly. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 4, settling into her preferred chair near the window where afternoon light illuminated her knitting while providing an excellent view of the assembled company. Mrs. Clarice Rowan appeared in elegant dove-grey silk, her manner perfectly composed, yet somehow watchful. Mr. Whitcomb followed shortly after, his London tailoring unable to disguise an underlying tension, while Mr. Pemberton brought his solicitor's gravity and an expensive leather portfolio. The conversation began pleasantly enough with Mrs. Bantry's enthusiastic praise for Mrs. Ashworth's contributions to village life. However, when discussion turned to the victim's final intentions, the atmosphere grew noticeably strained. She had mentioned revising her will, Mr. Pemberton revealed reluctantly, his fingers drumming against his teacup. Quite substantial changes, actually. She intended to establish a village endowment and settle certain outstanding obligations. His glance toward Mrs. Rowan carried unmistakable significance. Mrs. Rowan's smile remained perfectly calibrated. How typical of dear Vivian's generous nature, though I always urged her to consider her own security first, since in our business partnership she was far too trusting for her own good. Mr. Whitcomb's composure cracked slightly. Partnership? I understood you pressed her rather urgently about those Paris formulations. The assignment papers bore your name in pencil, waiting only for her signature. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. How fortunate that her dearest friend understood her little ritual so well, the crystal atomizer, the blessing ceremony. Those antique sprayers require such delicate handling, don't they? Mrs. Rowan's teacup rattled against its saucer. Quite so. Vivian was impossibly sentimental about that particular piece. A wedding gift, she claimed, though I always found it rather impractical. The gathering concluded with strained politeness, but Miss Marple had observed enough to confirm her growing suspicions. Mrs. Rowan's intimate knowledge of details she should not have possessed, combined with her defensive reactions to seemingly innocent observations, painted a troubling picture. Later that afternoon, young Tommy Pierce appeared at Miss Marple's garden gate with breathless excitement, clutching a telegram addressed to Mrs. Rowan. "Mrs. Clement thought you might find this interesting, Miss Marple," he panted, extending the yellow envelope. The message from a Bath hotel was brief but devastating. "No record Mrs. Rowan departure yesterday. Stop room occupied through weekend. Stop please advise regarding unpaid account." Miss Marple studied this revelation with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Rowan's dramatic story of rushing from Bath upon reading newspaper accounts collapsed entirely under this simple contradiction. She had been present in St. Mary Mead before the tragedy occurred, yet had concealed her presence until after Mrs. Ashworth's death made her reappearance safe. Armed with this knowledge, Miss Marple began reconstructing the true sequence of events. A discreet inquiry at the Blue Boar confirmed that an elegant woman matching Mrs. Rowan's description had taken a room 2 nights before the tragedy, paying in advance and requesting utmost discretion about her presence. The physical evidence at the Perfumery took on new significance when viewed through this lens. The replacement twine on the service bell pull, fine silken thread quite unlike village hardware, suggested someone with access to specialized materials. The footprints near the entrance included pointed toe impressions entirely inconsistent with Lily Barton's practical footwear, but matching Mrs. Rowan's fashionable shoes perfectly. Most revealing was the unstoppered vial Miss Marple had discovered behind the promotional leaflets. Its synthetic sweetness, so different from Mrs. Ashworth's natural fragrances, suggested a foreign preparation, something requiring specialized knowledge and equipment far beyond village herbalism. Dr. Haydock's examination of the residue confirmed her suspicions. "Laboratory quality work," he pronounced grimly. "Someone with extensive training in botanical chemistry. The concentration required would demand both expertise and proper equipment." The method itself revealed careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. Mrs. Rowan had gained access to the Perfumery during the preparation period, contaminating Mrs. Ashworth's beloved crystal atomizer with poisoned oil. She had then retreated to observe from concealment, waiting for the inevitable moment when her victim would perform the blessing ceremony that would prove fatal. The evidence against Lily Barton, the digitalis bottle, the typed dismissal note, even her convenient flight, had been carefully constructed to create a convincing alternative narrative. Mrs. Rowan's chemical training enabled her to prepare both the poison and the false evidence with professional competence, while her knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's habits provided the perfect delivery method. As evening approached, the village's certainty about the official solution began to waver. Miss Marple reflected on the elaborate deception that had nearly succeeded. Someone with both professional expertise and personal hatred had constructed what appeared to be a perfect crime, using the victim's own trust and cherished possessions as weapons against her. Yet patterns, like the lingering scent of deception, eventually revealed themselves to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand that the most obvious explanations often concealed far more complex truths. The morning brought Lily Barton's unexpected return to St. Mary Mead, accompanied by her formidable Aunt Dorothy from Bournemouth, whose existence proved entirely legitimate and whose testimony demolished Inspector Slack's carefully constructed case. Miss Marple encountered them outside the police station, where Lily's tear-stained face and trembling hands spoke of genuine terror rather than guilt. "My niece fled in panic when she discovered that dreadful typed note among her belongings," Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell declared, with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crises. She had never seen it before, and the digitalis bottle was certainly not hers. "I can produce witnesses who will confirm she was helping at my church bazaar when that poison was supposedly purchased." Lily's own testimony revealed crucial details about the Perfumery's final days. She had noticed Mrs. Rowan lingering near the service entrance on multiple occasions, always claiming to be surprising dear Vivian, yet never actually announcing herself. The elegant stranger had shown unusual interest in Mrs. Ashworth's personal effects, particularly the crystal atomizer and its ceremonial significance. She asked such specific questions about Mrs. Ashworth's routines, Lily whispered between sobs. When she performed the blessing ceremony, which bottles she used for special occasions, how she prepared the fragrances. I thought it was friendship, but the way she watched everything. Dr. Haydock's final analysis of the poison residue provided the most damning evidence against the official theory. The digitalis preparation showed traces of synthetic compounds requiring laboratory equipment and specialized knowledge far beyond amateur herbalism. Professional work, he confirmed grimly. Someone with extensive training in botanical chemistry. The concentration and purity suggest access to commercial-grade distillation equipment. Inspector Slack's confidence crumbled visibly as his case disintegrated. The typed dismissal note, the planted evidence, Lily's convenient flight, all suddenly appeared as carefully orchestrated misdirection rather than genuine proof of guilt. Miss Marple absorbed these revelations while maintaining her appearance of gentle interest in village affairs. Her own investigation had already identified Mrs. Rowan as the most likely perpetrator, but she needed to understand the woman's deeper motives before any direct confrontation became necessary. The opportunity for closer observation came that afternoon when Mrs. Rowan, apparently unaware of Lily's return, made a telling error in judgment. She appeared at the Perfumery with a leather case, claiming authority as Mrs. Ashworth's business partner to remove certain valuable formulations before they could be damaged by official neglect. Miss Marple, observing from the churchyard while tending the memorial roses, watched as the elegant woman emerged carrying bottles and papers. Her movements showed familiarity with the cottage's layout that contradicted her claims of recent arrival from Bath, and her selection of items suggested intimate knowledge of which formulations held commercial value. More intriguingly, Mrs. Rowan's appearance had subtly altered since the previous day. Her usual immaculate grooming showed tiny imperfections, a faint stain on her gloved fingertips that matched the synthetic residue Dr. Haydock had identified, and her typically flawless manicure revealed a thin crescent of darkness beneath one nail that spoke of hasty cleaning after handling something that left permanent traces. The scent she wore had changed as well, from her usual delicate rose to something heavier and more complex, heliotrope shading into something colder, more medicinal. Miss Marple, whose garden had taught her to read stories in fragrances, recognized the telltale signature of someone attempting to mask other odors with deliberate layering. Later that evening, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Rowan at the Blue Boar, where the woman was dining alone with apparent satisfaction. The conversation began innocuously enough, with polite inquiries about the tragic circumstances and the investigation's progress. "Such devoted friendship you shared with dear Mrs. Ashworth," Miss Marple observed gently. "Though I understand you are business associates as well. How fortunate that you arrived so quickly after reading the newspaper accounts." Mrs. Rowan's smile maintained its perfect calibration, but her fingers drummed against the tablecloth in a rhythm that betrayed underlying tension. One does what one must for dear friends. The journey from Bath was rather exhausting, but some obligations transcend personal convenience. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes held steady compassion mixed with quiet determination. "Bath is lovely this time of year, though I understand the hotels can be quite particular about their records. My nephew always insists on proper documentation for his business travels." The seemingly innocent observation struck with devastating precision. Mrs. Rowan's composure flickered almost imperceptibly as she realized her fabricated timeline had been questioned, though she recovered quickly enough to maintain the pretense of casual conversation. Yet Miss Marple had seen enough to confirm her growing certainty about the true sequence of events. Mrs. Rowan's intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's habits, her professional expertise with botanical chemistry, and her carefully constructed alibi all pointed toward a methodical killer who had planned every detail, except the possibility that a quiet old lady might notice the small inconsistencies that revealed the truth beneath the elegant deception. The morning after her discovery of the telegram from Bath, Miss Marple arranged what appeared to be a perfectly innocent visit to the Perfumery. She had telephoned Mrs. Rowan with gentle concern about the proper disposition of Mrs. Ashworth's remaining effects, suggesting that as the victim's dearest friend, she might wish to ensure certain precious items received appropriate care. The elegant woman agreed with what seemed like genuine gratitude, though Miss Marple detected a subtle eagerness beneath the polite acceptance. The cottage stood silent in the autumn afternoon, its diamond-paned windows reflecting the golden light while the herb garden released faint ghosts of yesterday's fragrances. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 3, her knitting bag in hand, and her manner suggesting nothing more threatening than elderly concern for proper proprieties. She found Mrs. Rowan already present, examining the midnight velvet display table with the sort of focused attention that spoke of more than casual interest. "Such a beautiful collection," Miss Marple observed, settling into a chair near the window where the afternoon light illuminated her knitting, while providing an excellent view of her companion's reactions. "Though I imagine it must be painful for you to see dear Mrs. Ashworth's work displayed like this. The crystal atomizer, in particular, she was so devoted to it, wasn't she?" Mrs. Rowan turned with practiced grace, her expression carefully modulated to suggest appropriate grief. "Indeed, Miss Marple, that atomizer was precious to her, a wedding gift, she claimed. Such a sentimental attachment to what was, after all, merely a functional instrument. Though I suppose we all have our little treasures." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she worked the familiar pattern, her pale blue eyes observing with a sort of gentle attention that invited confidences. "How fortunate that you understood her attachment to such ceremonies. The blessing of each guest with fragrance. Such a personal touch. Though I imagine it would require considerable expertise to operate such a delicate mechanism properly." The observation hung in the air like a question politely unasked. Mrs. Rowan moved closer to the display table, her fingers trailing across the midnight velvet with unconscious familiarity. Vivian was always particular about her rituals. The atomizer required a certain technique, yes. The pressure had to be just right to achieve the proper mist. Too much force and the spray would be uneven. Too little and it wouldn't disperse at all. Miss Marple paused in her knitting, as if struck by a sudden thought. "How interesting that you should know such specific details. Dr. Haydock mentioned that the residue analysis revealed some rather sophisticated chemistry. Laboratory quality work, he called it. The sort of preparation that would require both specialized equipment and extensive training to achieve the proper concentration." Mrs. Rowan's composure flickered almost imperceptibly, like a candle flame touched by an unexpected draught. "I'm afraid I wouldn't know about such technical matters. My interest in perfumery was always more aesthetic than scientific." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed gently, lifting a small vial from the table, the unstoppered container she had discovered behind the promotional leaflets. "Though this little vessel tells quite a different story. The synthetic residue it contains suggests someone with considerable expertise in botanical chemistry. Most curious, don't you think, that it should be hidden away like that?" The elegant woman's hands clenched slightly before she forced them to relax, her voice taking on a sharper edge despite her efforts to maintain casual conversation. "I'm sure I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple. Anyone might have left such a thing behind. A delivery person, perhaps, or one of the many visitors Mrs. Ashworth received." Miss Marple rose slowly, moving to examine the service entrance where the replacement twine still hung from the bell pull. "Silken thread," she observed, fingering the material with the practiced touch of someone who understood textiles. "Quite different from the original rope. Such fine work. The sort of material one might use for delicate packaging, perhaps." French packaging, I should imagine, given its particular weave. Mrs. Rowan followed her movement with the focused attention of someone calculating distances and possibilities. I really cannot see what significance a piece of string might have in these tragic circumstances. Oh, but details are so revealing, Miss Marple replied with the gentle smile of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human nature. Rather like your remarkable knowledge of village events for someone who claims to have arrived only after reading newspaper accounts. The Bath Hotel was most helpful when I inquired about your departure. Such careful record-keeping they maintain. They confirmed you retained your room throughout the weekend, with no record of any departure until this morning. The accusation struck with devastating precision. Mrs. Rowan's elegant facade began to crack as she realized her carefully constructed timeline had been thoroughly examined and found wanting. Her voice turned cold and defensive as she abandoned the pretense of casual conversation. I don't appreciate your implications, Miss Marple. If you're suggesting I had anything to do with Vivian's death, that's utterly preposterous. I was her dearest friend, her business partner. Why would I wish her harm? Miss Marple's pale blue eyes held steady compassion mixed with quiet determination. Business partnerships can be complicated things, can't they? Particularly when one partner possesses formulations that the other considers rightfully theirs. Mr. Whitcomb mentioned those Paris formulations that bore your name in pencil, waiting only for Mrs. Ashworth's signature. Mrs. Rowan's laugh held no warmth as she realized the extent of Miss Marple's investigation. You've been remarkably thorough for someone who merely knits and tends gardens. Perhaps too thorough for your own good. I've simply been patient, Miss Marple replied gently. Patient enough to notice that the scent you wore yesterday was heliotrope mixed with something more medicinal, the sort of synthetic solvent one might use in laboratory work. And patient enough to observe that your gloves bore traces of the same oily residue Dr. Haydock found in Mrs. Ashworth's throat. The confrontation had achieved its purpose. Mrs. Rowan's composure shattered completely as she realized that her elaborate deception had been methodically unraveled by a quiet old lady who understood that the most obvious explanations often concealed far more complex truths. Her mask of grief and friendship fell away, revealing the calculating desperation beneath. She had no right, Mrs. Rowan burst out, her voice rising with long-suppressed fury. Those formulations were as much mine as hers. She thought she could flee to this provincial backwater and leave me with nothing but debts and broken promises. Miss Marple nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose careful psychological test had provoked exactly the critical reaction she had been seeking. The truth had been patiently waiting for someone wise enough to recognize it beneath the elegant layers of misdirection, and now it stood revealed in all its bitter clarity. Mrs. Rowan's confession poured forth with the bitter fury of someone whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled beyond repair. The elegant woman who had arrived in St. Mary Mead claiming grief over her dearest friend's death now stood revealed as something far more dangerous, her composure abandoned as years of suppressed resentment erupted into the cottage's perfumed air. You cannot imagine what it was like, she continued, her voice shaking with long-contained rage. Years of partnership, years of shared research in our Paris laboratory, only to discover that Vivian had been systematically transferring our most valuable formulations into her personal accounts. When her husband's import business collapsed under government investigation, she took everything, my life's work, and fled to this ridiculous village to play at being a respectable widow. Miss Marple listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that the human heart, once opened, reveals its darkest secrets with devastating honesty. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she absorbed the full scope of the betrayal that had led to murder. The formulations were as much mine as hers, Mrs. Rowan declared with self-righteous indignation. I provided the scientific expertise, the botanical chemistry, the years of careful research. She merely contributed charm and social connections. But when the creditors came calling, when those dubious associates of her husband's began making threats, she took my life's work and disappeared. leaving me to face the consequences alone. The crystal atomizer caught the afternoon light as Mrs. Rowan lifted it from the display table, her fingers caressing its surface with the intimate familiarity of long ownership. This belonged to my grandmother, a wedding gift from my grandfather's perfumery in Grasse. Vivienne claimed it was hers, another of her pretty lies. She used my own family heirloom to perform her theatrical ceremonies, never knowing I had prepared it specially for our final meeting. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding as the full sophistication of the crime became clear. You contaminated the atomizer with concentrated digitalis dissolved in a synthetic carrier oil, knowing she would use it during the blessing ceremony. The poison was absorbed through her skin and mucous membranes with each spray. Poetic justice, wouldn't you say? Mrs. Rowan's smile held no warmth as she demonstrated the atomizer's delicate mechanism with practiced ease. She was so proud of her little rituals, so devoted to sharing her artistic vision with these provincial admirers. I simply ensured that her final performance would be truly memorable. The method's calculated precision became clear as Mrs. Rowan explained her preparation. She had arrived in St. Mary Mead 3 days before the party, staying at the Blue Boar under a false name while observing Mrs. Ashworth's routines. During the afternoon setup, she had gained access to the cottage through the service entrance, replacing the atomizer's contents with her lethal mixture while Mrs. Ashworth was occupied with catering arrangements. The beauty of it was the delayed reaction, she continued with clinical detachment. Digitalis requires time to affect the heart rhythm, allowing me to retreat to my observation point while appearing completely innocent. By the time she collapsed, I was simply another shocked guest witnessing a tragic medical emergency. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes held steady compassion even as she absorbed the calculated cruelty of the plan. And poor Lily Barton, you planted evidence to ensure she would be blamed for your crime. Mrs. Rowan's laugh held bitter satisfaction. That pathetic creature made the perfect scapegoat. Her grandmother's reputation as an herbalist, her access to the perfumery, even her unfortunate tendency to pilfer small amounts from the till, everything pointed toward her guilt. I simply provided the final evidence to ensure the investigation would conclude satisfactorily. The digitalis bottle, the typed dismissal note, even Lily's panicked flight had been carefully orchestrated to create an unshakable case against the innocent shop assistant. Mrs. Rowan had used her knowledge of village gossip and Inspector Slack's eagerness for swift resolution to construct what appeared to be perfect misdirection. You underestimated the power of patient observation, Miss Marple observed gently, rising slowly from her chair. Small details have a way of revealing larger truths to those willing to notice them. The synthetic residue on your gloves that matched the laboratory solvent in the hidden vial. The silken thread you used to repair the bell pull after forcing entry. French packaging material quite unlike anything available in our village shop. The pointed toe, footprints in the soft earth, so different from Lily's practical shoes. Even the scent you wore to mask the laboratory odors. Heliotrope layered over something more medicinal. Mrs. Rowan's expression hardened as she realized the extent of Miss Marple's methodical investigation. You've been remarkably thorough for someone who merely tends gardens and knits baby clothes, though I wonder what you propose to do with your discoveries. The threat hung unspoken in the cottage air, heavy with the weight of revealed secrets and the lingering fragrance of Mrs. Ashworth's final creation. Mrs. Rowan's hand tightened on the crystal atomizer. Her elegant features twisted with desperate calculation as she realized her elaborate deception had been completely unraveled. I propose to ensure that justice is served, Miss Marple replied with quiet dignity, though she remained carefully positioned near the cottage door. Poor Mrs. Ashworth deserves better than to have her murder blamed on an innocent girl, and Lily Barton deserves to have her name cleared of these terrible accusations. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mrs. Rowan said, her voice turning cold and dangerous. You've learned far too much for your own good, Miss Marple. I cannot allow you to destroy everything I've worked to accomplish. It was at that precise moment that the cottage door opened with quiet authority, and Inspector Slack stepped inside, accompanied by 2 constables. Miss Marple had, of course, arranged for their arrival, having sent young Tommy Pierce with a carefully worded note requesting the inspector's presence to witness what she described as certain curious observations about the Perfumery case. "Mrs. Rowan," Inspector Slack began, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, "I believe you have some explaining to do regarding the death of Mrs. Vivian Ashworth." The elegant woman's shoulders sagged as she realized that her final gambit had failed. The crystal atomizer slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the flagstones with the same sharp music that had marked her victim's champagne flute 3 days earlier. Her confession had been heard by proper authorities, and the intricate web of deception she had spun with such meticulous care lay in ruins around her. As the constables led Mrs. Rowan away, her elegant composure finally and completely abandoned, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic waste of it all. 2 lives destroyed by greed and betrayal, an innocent girl nearly ruined by false accusations, and a peaceful village forever changed by the knowledge that evil could wear such a refined and cultured face. The cottage stood silent once more, its herb garden releasing faint ghosts of yesterday's fragrances into the autumn air. But now the scent of remembrance would forever carry with it the memory of how beauty and trust had been perverted into instruments of death, and how patient observation had finally revealed the truth beneath the most elegant of lies. The morning after Mrs. Rowan's arrest brought a peculiar quiet to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were holding its breath while absorbing the magnitude of what had transpired. The autumn frost silvered the cottage gardens and touched the diamond-paned windows of the perfumery with crystalline patterns that caught the pale sunlight like captured secrets finally released. Inspector Slack emerged from his ordeal with professional dignity intact, though Miss Marple noticed how his account of the investigation gradually evolved to emphasize his own methodical deductions, while diplomatically minimizing the role of elderly observation. She made no effort to correct these embellishments, understanding that official authority required its face-saving rituals, even when that authority had initially pursued entirely wrong conclusions. The village's reaction revealed that complex mixture of relief and unease that accompanies the discovery of evil wearing elegant disguise. Mrs. Price Ridley proclaimed vindication of her initial suspicions about continental sophistication, while conveniently forgetting her enthusiastic acceptance of Mrs. Rowan's cultured charm. Colonel Melchett maintained that military instincts had warned him something was amiss, though his actual behavior had suggested nothing more threatening than masculine appreciation for feminine elegance. Lily Barton's complete exoneration brought its own emotional complexities. The young woman returned to her cottage pale and shaken, her faith in human nature severely tested by the discovery that someone had deliberately attempted to destroy her life to conceal their own guilt. Her grandmother, Mrs. Barton, maintained dignified silence about the accusations leveled against her granddaughter, though her manner suggested certain villagers would find future requests for herbal remedies received with considerably less enthusiasm. Dr. Haydock provided the medical testimony that would ensure Mrs. Rowan's conviction, explaining how the synthetic digitalis preparation demonstrated laboratory-quality expertise far beyond amateur herbalism. The concentration and purity of the poison, combined with its sophisticated delivery through the contaminated atomizer, painted a picture of premeditated murder executed with scientific precision that had nearly succeeded in its misdirection. The perfumery itself presented a melancholy problem requiring delicate handling. Mrs. Ashworth's solicitor revealed that her will had indeed been revised shortly before her death, establishing a village endowment for beautification of public spaces while settling outstanding debts with admirable thoroughness. The cottage and its contents would be sold, with proceeds contributing to the charitable fund that would serve as her lasting memorial. Miss Marple found herself appointed to oversee disposition of Mrs. Ashworth's personal effects. a responsibility she accepted with characteristic grace despite its painful associations. Working through the cottage's contents, she discovered evidence of the victim's genuine affection for her adopted village. Sketches for expanded herb gardens, plans for perfume-making classes, correspondence about establishing permanent presence in St. Mary Mead. Most poignantly, she found Mrs. Ashworth's private journal, its final entries revealing a woman who had found peace after years of difficulty and fear. The last entry, written the morning of her death, expressed gratitude for her neighbor's kindness and excitement about the evening's celebration. There was no hint of awareness that her former partner had discovered her refuge, no suggestion that death approached with such calculated precision. The trial, when it came, provided sensational entertainment that London newspapers found irresistible. Mrs. Rowan's elegant appearance and sophisticated background made her an object of fascination, while the rural setting and botanical murder method satisfied public appetite for cozy mysteries with deadly conclusions. Her conviction was never in doubt, given the weight of evidence Miss Marple's patient investigation had uncovered. As autumn deepened into winter and the village settled back into familiar rhythms, Miss Marple often found herself walking past the empty cottage at Elder Lane's End. The herb garden had been maintained by village volunteers, its neat borders of lavender and rosemary continuing to release fragrances into the crisp air. The climbing roses, now dormant, waited patiently for spring's return. She reflected on the tragic waste, 2 lives destroyed by greed and betrayal, a peaceful community, forever changed by knowledge that evil could wear such refined faces. Yet there was satisfaction in knowing that patient observation and quiet determination had ensured justice was served, that an innocent girl's reputation had been restored, and that truth had finally emerged from beneath elegant layers of deception. The cottage would soon have new occupants. The village would adapt as it had adapted to countless changes over centuries, and life would continue its eternal patterns. But the memory of Mrs. Vivian Ashworth would linger like a favorite fragrance, beautiful and bittersweet, reminding all who had known her that even the most carefully constructed lies cannot ultimately triumph over the patient pursuit of truth. In her knitting bag, Miss Marple carried a small vial of remembrance, a final gift from Mrs. Ashworth's collection, serving as tangible reminder of how beauty and trust had been perverted into instruments of death, and how quiet observation of human nature had finally revealed the darkness beating beneath the most elegant of exteriors.